Ethan had always loved camping alone because it gave him a chance to escape the noise of everyday life. He was a 32-year-old office worker from Denver who spent most of his days staring at computer screens and attending endless meetings. After one particularly stressful week, he decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the mountains of Montana. The location he chose was known for its beautiful scenery and complete isolation. Few people visited the area because it was several miles from the nearest road. Ethan packed his gear into his pickup truck and left before sunrise on a Friday morning. During the drive, he listened to podcasts and enjoyed the feeling of freedom that came with leaving the city behind. By late afternoon, he arrived at the trailhead where his adventure would begin. The forest looked peaceful beneath the golden light of the setting sun. At that moment, he had no idea he was heading toward one of the most terrifying nights of his life. The hike to the campsite took nearly an hour and a half through dense pine forest. The trail became narrower the deeper Ethan traveled into the wilderness. Birds chirped from the treetops while a cool breeze moved through the branches overhead. Everything felt calm and ordinary. Eventually, he found a small clearing surrounded by cowering trees and decided it was the perfect place to spend the night. He pitched his tent, gathered firewood, and prepared a simple dinner over a campfire. As darkness slowly settled across the forest, the sounds of nature began to change. Daytime birds disappeared and were replaced by distant owl calls. The woods became quieter with each passing minute, until only the crackling fire remained. By 10 o'clock that night, Ethan was sitting alone beside the dying campfire. The stars above were incredibly bright because there were no city lights for hundreds of miles. He leaned back in his folding chair and enjoyed the peaceful silence. Suddenly, a long whistle echoed through the darkness. The sound came from somewhere beyond the trees to the north of his campsite. At first, Ethan assumed it was another camper trying to get someone's attention. The whistle sounded almost human, which immediately caught his attention. A few moments later, the same whistle came again. This time it lasted longer and seemed slightly closer. Ethan sat upright and listened carefully as an uncomfortable feeling settled in his stomach. He waited several minutes for another sound, but heard nothing. The forest had become unnaturally silent. Even the insects seemed to have stopped making noise. Then the whistle came again from a completely different direction. Instead of the north, it now sounded as if it were coming from the east side of the campsite. Ethan frowned because there was no way a person could move that quickly through the dense forest. He stood up and shined his flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated tree trunks, bushes, and patches of grass, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. He called out and asked if someone needed help. Only silence answered him. Trying to convince himself that there was a logical explanation, Ethan returned to his chair. However, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every few minutes he found himself glancing toward the trees. The darkness between the trunks seemed deeper than before. Then the whistle returned once more. This time it was much closer. It sounded as though whoever made it was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Ethan's heart began to beat faster. He grabbed his flashlight again and slowly walked toward the sound. With every step, the forest felt colder and more oppressive. Yet when he reached the trees, there was nobody there. Feeling uneasy, Feeling decided it was time to get some sleep. He extinguished the campfire and climbed into his tent. The thin fabric walls suddenly felt inadequate against the vast darkness outside. He zipped the entrance closed and settled into his sleeping bag. For a while, everything remained quiet. Then, just as he was beginning to drift off, the whistle sounded again. This time, it came from directly outside the tent. Ethan's eyes snapped open instantly. Every muscle in his body became tense. The sound was so close that it seemed impossible for anything to be standing there without casting a shadow on the tent wall. He remained perfectly still and listened. After several seconds, another noise reached his ears. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving slowly through the grass. The steps circled around the tent at a deliberate pace. Whoever or whatever was outside appeared to be walking in a perfect loop around him. Ethan reached for the folding knife he kept beside his sleeping bag. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the cold night air. The footsteps continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly near the entrance of the tent. A heavy silence followed. Ethan could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he waited for whatever would happen next. Then something happened that terrified him more than the footsteps. A voice spoke from outside the tent. It softly said his name. Ethan froze in disbelief. There was no reason anyone in that forest should know who he was. The voice sounded strangely familiar, almost like someone he had known for years. It called his name again, this time in a gentle tone. Ethan felt a chill run through his entire body when he realized where he recognized the voice from. It sounded exactly like his mother. The problem was that his mother had died 3 years earlier. The voice continued speaking, asking him to come outside because it wanted to show him something. Every instinct told Ethan not to respond. The voice sounded close enough to touch, yet something about it felt wrong. The words were slightly delayed, as if whoever spoke them was imitating human speech rather than naturally producing it. Ethan remained silent and held his breath. After a few moments, the voice stopped. The footsteps resumed and slowly moved away from the tent. Relief washed over him briefly, but it didn't last long. A few minutes later, he heard the whistle again from deeper within the forest. The sound seemed to be inviting him to follow it into the darkness. Around 2 in the morning, curiosity finally overcame fear. Ethan carefully unzipped a small section of the tent and looked outside. The moonlight illuminated part of the clearing, casting long shadows across the ground. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes focused on a figure standing among the trees about 50 yards away. The figure was impossibly tall and unnaturally thin. It stood completely motionless between 2 pine trees. Ethan could not make out its face, but he knew with absolute certainty that it was staring directly at him. For several horrifying seconds, neither of them moved. Then the figure slowly tilted its head to one side. Ethan immediately closed the tent flap, knowing deep down that the night was far from over. After closing the tent flap, Ethan backed away from the entrance and sat motionless in the darkness. His breathing was shallow, and his hands trembled as he gripped the knife. He kept replaying the image of the tall figure in his mind. Something about it didn't seem human. The proportions were wrong, and the way it tilted its head felt unnatural. Ethan considered packing up and leaving immediately. However, the trail back to his truck wound through miles of dense forest. Walking it alone in the middle of the night seemed even more dangerous. For now, he decided his safest option was to stay inside the tent until sunrise. He just hoped whatever was outside would leave before then. Several minutes passed without any sound. Ethan began to wonder if the figure had disappeared. Then he heard a faint rustling noise near the campsite. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was moving through the clearing itself, slowly and carefully. The sound reminded him of someone dragging their feet through tall grass. He held his breath and listened. The noise moved closer and closer until it stopped beside the tent. Ethan could almost feel a presence standing only inches away from the thin fabric wall. His entire body froze as a dark shadow appeared on the side of the tent. The shadow was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was far taller than an average person. Its head nearly reached the top of the tent, despite standing several feet away. Long, thin arms hung at its sides. The figure remained completely still. Ethan stared at the silhouette, unable to look away. Every survival instinct in his body screamed that he should stay silent. Seconds felt like hours as the shadow remained there. Then, without warning, it moved. One long arm slowly lifted toward the tent wall. Ethan felt his stomach drop as the shadow's hand touched the fabric. The material pressed inward slightly under the weight of the hand. Ethan could clearly see the outline of long fingers. They seemed unusually thin and stretched far beyond normal human proportions. The fingers slid slowly across the side of the tent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound echoed through the darkness. Ethan squeezed the knife tighter and fought the urge to panic. He knew that if he made noise, whatever was outside might react. The scratching continued for nearly a minute before suddenly stopping. Then everything became silent again. Ethan waited, expecting the figure to leave. Instead, he heard something even worse. Soft laughter drifted through the darkness. It sounded distant at first, then it grew louder. The laugh wasn't friendly or joyful. It sounded like someone attempting to imitate human laughter without understanding how emotions worked. There was something empty and hollow about it. The sound circled around the campsite, moving impossibly fast between different locations. One moment it came from behind the tent, the next it seemed to come from the trees 50 yards away. Ethan had never heard anything like it. The laughter eventually faded, leaving only silence behind. Ethan checked his watch. It was 2:47 a.m. Sunrise was still hours away. He felt exhausted but knew sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined the tall figure standing outside. He tried to distract himself by focusing on practical thoughts. He planned the fastest route back to his truck. He mentally reviewed every piece of gear he had packed. He even considered calling emergency services, but there was no signal. Out there, he was completely on his own. Around 3 in the morning, a new sound emerged from the forest. It was faint at first, a rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The noise seemed to come from deep among the trees. Ethan listened carefully. The tapping continued at perfectly even intervals. It sounded almost mechanical. Every few seconds it would stop, then start again from a different direction. The pattern continued for nearly 20 minutes. Whatever was making the noise appeared to be circling the campsite from a distance. Ethan could not think of any animal behavior that matched what he was hearing. As the tapping grew closer, Ethan noticed something strange. The air inside the tent felt colder, much colder. His breath became visible in front of him despite the season. Goosebumps covered his arms. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees within minutes. Then came the whistle again, long, slow, deliberate. This time it sounded directly behind him. Ethan spun around, even though he knew the tent was closed. The whistle lasted nearly 10 seconds before ending abruptly. The silence afterward felt heavier than ever. Without warning, a loud bang struck the side of the tent. Ethan nearly jumped out of his sleeping bag. Another bang followed, then another. It sounded like someone hitting the tent with both hands. The entire structure shook violently. Ethan pressed himself against the opposite wall, terrified that the poles might collapse. The impacts continued for several seconds before stopping. Suddenly, everything became still. Ethan waited for another strike, but none came. Instead, he heard slow footsteps moving away from the campsite once more. The sound gradually disappeared into the darkness. Eventually, the first signs of dawn began to appear. A faint gray light filtered through the fabric of the tent. Ethan had never been so relieved to see morning arrive. As sunlight spread across the forest, the atmosphere immediately felt different. The oppressive feeling that had surrounded the campsite vanished. Birds began singing again. The forest seemed alive and normal once more. After gathering enough courage, Ethan stepped outside. What he found made his blood run cold. Surrounding the tent were dozens of deep footprints, forming perfect circles around the campsite, and every single footprint pointed toward the tent, as if something had spent the entire night standing there and watching him. When Ethan stepped outside that morning, the first thing he noticed was how quiet the forest had become. The strange sounds from night before were completely gone. Birds were singing again, and sunlight streamed through the pine trees. For a brief moment, he wondered if exhaustion had caused him to imagine everything. Then he looked down at the ground around his campsite. His stomach immediately tightened. Dozens of footprints surrounded the tent in perfect circles. They were much larger than normal human footprints. Some of them were pressed so deeply into the soil that they looked as if a heavy creature had stood there for hours. Ethan quickly grabbed his phone and began taking pictures. The footprints didn't lead toward the forest like he expected. Instead, they formed several rings around the tent before suddenly stopping. There were no tracks leading away from the campsite. Ethan walked around the area several times, searching for an explanation. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions clearly. If an animal or person had left, there should have been a trail somewhere. Yet there was nothing. It looked as though whatever made the footprints had simply vanished. The realization sent a chill through him despite the warm morning sun. Ethan packed his gear faster than he ever had before. He wanted to be out of those woods as quickly as possible. As he hacked back toward the trailhead, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder. Each time he saw only trees swaying gently in the wind. The forest looked completely normal now. That somehow made the previous night feel even stranger. Ethan tried convincing himself that stress and lack of sleep had affected his judgment. Maybe there had been another camper nearby. Maybe the voice and whistles had ordinary explanations. Yet deep down he knew those explanations didn't fit what he had experienced. The memory of the figure standing among the trees remained crystal clear in his mind. About 40 minutes into the hike, Ethan noticed something unusual beside the trail. Hidden beneath vines and moss stood an old wooden sign. Most of the lettering had faded away over time. Curious, he stepped closer and brushed away the dirt covering its surface. Only part of the message remained visible. The words read, "Warning, do not remain after dark." Beneath the warning was a date from more than 50 years earlier. Ethan stared at the sign in confusion. If the area had been considered dangerous, why hadn't he seen any modern warnings? The discovery left him feeling even more unsettled. When Ethan finally reached his truck, relief washed over him. He tossed his backpack into the bed and climbed behind the wheel. The engine started immediately. As he pulled onto the dirt road leading away from the forest, he glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. At first, everything seemed normal. Then he froze. Far behind him, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a tall, dark figure. It was too far away to identify clearly, yet there was no mistaking its unusual height. Ethan blinked once. The figure was gone. He pressed harder on the gas pedal and didn't look back again. An hour later, Ethan stopped at a small roadside diner to grab breakfast. The place was quiet, except for a few elderly locals drinking coffee. While waiting for his order, he casually mentioned the area where he had camped. The reaction was immediate. Several conversations stopped at once. One old man sitting near the window slowly turned toward him. The expression on his face suggested he had heard something he didn't like. After a moment, the man walked over and sat across from Ethan without asking permission. He asked a single question. "Did you hear the whistling?" Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. When Ethan nodded, the old man lowered his voice. He explained that stories about the forest had existed for generations. According to local legends, people sometimes heard whistles deep in the woods after dark. The sounds often seemed to move impossible distances in seconds. Those who followed the whistles frequently became lost. Some were eventually found miles from where they had disappeared. Others were never seen again. The old man claimed his own uncle had vanished in those woods nearly 30 years earlier. Search teams spent weeks looking for him without success. All they found was an abandoned campsite. The old man wasn't finished. He said many witnesses described hearing familiar voices during their encounters. Some heard spouses calling their names. Others heard children crying for help. A few even reported hearing relatives who had died years earlier. The stories were so similar that many locals refused to enter the forest after sunset. Ethan listened carefully, feeling a growing sense of dread. Every detail matched what had happened to him the previous night. The voice of his mother echoed in his memory. He suddenly wished he had never asked about the area at all. After breakfast, Ethan drove straight home to Denver. He spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the photographs from his trip. The footprints looked even stranger on a larger screen. Curious, he uploaded several images to an online hiking forum. Within hours, dozens of comments appeared. Most people dismissed the photos as fake. Some suggested they were bear tracks distorted by weather conditions. Others insisted the prints belonged to a prankster wearing oversized boots. Ethan was about to log off when a new message appeared from a user named Forest Watcher 72. The message simply read, "You need to leave this alone before it notices you." That night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the warning. Around midnight, he checked the forum again. The account that had sent the message was gone. It had been deleted entirely. Feeling uneasy, he shut down his computer and headed to bed. Just as he turned off the lights, his phone vibrated on the nightstand. A new text message appeared from an unknown number. There was no written message attached, only a photograph. Ethan opened it and felt the blood drain from his face. The image showed his campsite from the previous night. It had been taken from deep within the trees, and standing beside his tent was a dark figure staring directly at the camera. Ethan stared at the photograph for several seconds, unable to process what he was seeing. The image was dark and grainy, but the figure was clearly visible. It stood beside his tent with its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The timestamp on the photo showed it had been taken at 2:13 a.m., right around the time he heard the voice outside. His hands began to shake as he zoomed in on the figure. The face remained hidden in shadow, but the body appeared impossibly tall and thin. Ethan immediately called the number back. The call connected, but all he heard was faint static before the line went dead. For the next hour, Ethan sat awake in his apartment staring at his phone. He tried convincing himself it was some kind of prank. Maybe another camper had secretly photographed him and decided to mess with him afterward. Yet the explanation felt weak. There had been no other vehicles at the trailhead, no campsites nearby, no voices except the one he heard during the night. Around 1 in the morning, another text message arrived. This one contained only 3 words: "Still watching you." Ethan's stomach dropped instantly. The message came from the same unknown number. Before he could reply, the number became unreachable. Sleep was impossible that night. Ethan eventually turned on every light in his apartment and sat on the couch. The city outside seemed unusually quiet. Even the traffic noise felt distant. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he noticed something moving outside his living room window. At first, he thought it was a reflection. Then the movement happened again. Ethan slowly approached the glass and looked down toward the street below. A lone figure stood on the sidewalk across from his building. The person appeared unusually tall. It wasn't moving. It was simply standing there facing the apartment complex. Ethan rubbed his eyes and looked again. The figure was gone. The following morning, Ethan called in sick to work. He spent most of the day researching the forest and the stories surrounding it. Hours passed as he searched old news archives, hiking forums, and local history websites. Most articles dismissed the disappearances as accidents. However, a few reports caught his attention. Several missing persons cases had occurred within a 10-mile radius of his campsite. Many of the victims vanished without leaving evidence behind. Search teams often described unusual conditions during investigations. Some reported equipment failures, others mentioned hearing strange sounds during nighttime searches. Ethan felt increasingly uncomfortable the more he learned. Late that afternoon, he received a reply from a forum user named Forest Watcher 72. Ethan had sent a message asking what the warning meant. To his surprise, the user responded. The message was short but alarming. The user claimed to be a retired search and rescue volunteer who had worked in the area years earlier. According to him, unusual encounters were common, but rarely discussed publicly. People reported hearing whistles, voices, and footsteps around their campsites. The volunteer claimed he personally investigated 5 disappearances that remained unsolved. His final sentence disturbed Ethan the most. If it followed you home, don't answer when it calls. That night, Ethan locked every door and window before going to bed. He left a lamp on in the bedroom and kept his phone beside him. Around midnight, exhaustion finally pulled him into a light sleep. Then his phone rang. Ethan woke instantly. The caller ID displayed unknown number. For several seconds, he stared at the screen. The warning from Forest Watcher 72 echoed in his mind. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear. He answered the call but remained silent. At first, he heard nothing except static. Then a familiar voice spoke. Ethan. His entire body went rigid. The voice belonged to his mother. It sounded exactly like her. Every detail was perfect, from her tone to her gentle way of saying his name. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes before fear quickly replaced emotion. His mother had been dead for 3 years. The voice continued speaking softly. It asked him why he hadn't come outside the tent that night. It sounded disappointed, almost hurt. Ethan immediately ended the call and threw the phone onto the bed. A few moments later, another call came in, then another, then another. Each call originated from a different number. Ethan refused to answer. The phone continued ringing every few minutes. Finally, after the 10th call, he switched the device off completely. The apartment became silent once again. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed listening to the darkness. That's when he heard it, a whistle. Long, slow, deliberate. The sound drifted through the night air from somewhere outside his apartment building. Ethan felt his blood turn cold. The whistle was identical to the one he had heard in the forest. The sound came again several minutes later. This time it seemed closer. Ethan carefully moved toward the bedroom window. He pulled back the curtain just enough to look outside. The street below appeared empty. Then he noticed something near the entrance of the building across the road. A tall figure stood beneath a streetlight. Despite the distance, Ethan immediately recognized its unnatural proportions. The figure wasn't moving. It simply stood there facing his building. As Ethan watched, the figure slowly raised one arm. Then it pointed directly toward his window. Ethan stumbled backward and nearly fell. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. When he looked outside again, the figure had vanished. The street was completely empty. For the remainder of the night, he sat awake with every light turned on. Dawn eventually arrived, bringing temporary relief. Yet deep down, Ethan knew something had changed. Whatever he encountered in the forest had not stayed behind. Somehow, impossibly, it had followed him home. And judging by the messages, the calls, and the figure outside his building, it wasn't finished with him yet. The next morning, Ethan looked exhausted. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes, and his hands still trembled slightly whenever he thought about the previous night. He considered going to the police, but what would he tell them? That a creature from the forest was sending him messages and calling him using his dead mother's voice? It sounded insane even inside his own head. Still, he knew he couldn't simply ignore what was happening. If there was even a small chance that someone was stalking him, he needed answers. Ethan called his office and requested a few days off. Then he began digging deeper into the history of the forest. For hours he searched through old newspaper archives and public records. Most of the missing person cases were frustratingly vague. Names, dates, and locations were listed, but very few details were available. Then Ethan found something unusual. A local newspaper from 1987 contained an interview with a search and rescue volunteer. The article described a missing hunter who vanished after spending a night alone in the woods. According to the volunteer, the hunter's campsite was discovered untouched. His gear remained exactly where he had left it. Food was still sitting beside the campfire. The only strange detail mentioned in the report were a series of large footprints surrounding the tent. Ethan's heart raced as he continued reading. The article included comments from other rescuers involved in the search. Several claimed they heard whistling while combing the forest. One volunteer even reported hearing his wife's voice calling from the trees, despite knowing she was hundreds of miles away at home. The official report dismissed these claims as stress-related hallucinations, yet the similarities to Ethan's experience were impossible to ignore. The whistles, the voices, the footprints, every detail matched. It felt as though the same thing had been happening for decades, maybe even longer. Determined to learn more, Ethan contacted the newspaper that published the article. The original reporter had long since retired, but after several phone calls, Ethan managed to obtain a phone number. That afternoon he spoke with the elderly journalist. The man sounded surprised that anyone still cared about those old stories. At first he laughed them off as local legends. However, his tone changed when Ethan mentioned the whistling. A long silence followed. Then the reporter admitted there were many details that never appeared in print. Some information had been intentionally withheld to avoid causing panic. According to the reporter, several witnesses described seeing a tall figure near the locations where people disappeared. The descriptions varied slightly, but certain details remained consistent. The figure was always unusually thin. It often appeared at the edge of a clearing or between trees. Frequently reported seeing it stand completely motionless for long periods of time. Others claimed it mimicked voices. The strangest part was that no two witnesses could agree on its face. Some described a human face, others said the face was hidden. A few claimed there was no face at all. The contradictions only made the mystery more disturbing. After ending the call, Ethan reviewed all the evidence he had collected. The pattern was becoming clear. The disappearances, the whistles, and the sightings were connected. Yet he still didn't know what the figure actually was. As evening approached, he received an email from Forest Watcher 72. Attached to the message was a scanned photograph taken during a search operation in 1994. The image showed a group of rescuers standing in a forest clearing. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, Ethan noticed something in the background. Between two trees stood a tall, shadowy figure. It looked almost identical to the one from the photograph of his campsite. The email contained a short note beneath the image. It read, "Look behind them." Ethan zoomed in further. What he found made his blood run cold. Behind the search team, partially hidden among the trees, were several other figures. They were difficult to see because of the poor image quality. However, they appeared to be standing perfectly still, watching. Ethan counted at least 4 of them. None of the rescuers seemed aware they were there. The realization was horrifying. If the photograph was genuine, there wasn't just one creature in the forest. There could be many. That night, Ethan received another message from Forest Watcher 72. This one was longer than the previous emails. The sender explained that he had spent years researching the disappearances. He believed the creatures were territorial. Most encounters ended when victims ignored them and left the area quickly. However, some people became obsessed with the phenomenon. They returned to the forest repeatedly, searching for answers. According to the message, those individuals often vanished. The sender warned Ethan not to continue investigating. "The more attention you give them," the email stated, "the more attention they give you." Ethan wanted to listen to the warning. He truly did, but fear had slowly been replaced by curiosity. He needed to understand what had happened to him. As midnight approached, he sat at his desk reviewing photographs and articles. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. The city beyond the glass seemed distant and unreal. Then a sudden noise interrupted his thoughts. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan froze. The noise wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from somewhere inside his apartment. The tapping continued at perfectly even intervals. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan slowly stood and listened. The noise appeared to be coming from the hallway leading toward the front door. Every few seconds it stopped, only to begin again slightly closer. Ethan felt a familiar wave of dread spread through his chest. It was the same rhythmic tapping he had heard in the forest, the same sound that circled his campsite in the darkness. He grabbed a kitchen knife and carefully approached the hallway. As he reached the corner and looked toward the front door, the tapping completely stopped. Then, from the other side of the door, a long whistle echoed through the silence. The whistle lingered in the hallway for several seconds before fading into silence. Ethan stood frozen, gripping the kitchen knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Every instinct told him not to open the door. The warning from Forest Watcher 72 echoed through his mind. The messages, the phone calls, and the sightings all pointed to the same conclusion. Whatever had followed him from the forest wanted attention. It wanted a response. Ethan took a slow step backward, then another. He decided he would not open the door no matter what happened. For nearly a minute, nothing moved on the other side. Just as he began to relax, 3 slow knocks sounded against the door. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deliberate and calm. It didn't resemble the impatient knock of a neighbor or delivery driver. It felt more like an invitation. Ethan remained silent. Another series of knocks followed. Then the hallway became quiet again. He carefully approached the peephole and looked outside. The corridor appeared empty. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered softly. No person stood near the door. No footsteps echoed through the hallway. Yet something felt wrong. The silence seemed unnatural. After several minutes passed, Ethan finally stepped away from the door. He returned to the living room and tried to focus on anything else. He turned on the television and increased the volume. He checked social media and replied to a few work messages. None of it helped. The feeling of being watched remained. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, his phone vibrated. A new message had arrived from an unknown number. Ethan hesitated before opening it. The text contained only 4 words. "Look outside your window." His stomach immediately tightened. He didn't want to look, but eventually curiosity won. Ethan walked to the living room window and carefully pulled the curtain aside. The street below appeared mostly empty. Rain continued falling under the glow of the street lights. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes focused on the sidewalk across the street. A figure stood beneath a bus stop shelter. It was unusually tall and completely motionless. Water streamed down its dark silhouette. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. Then another figure became visible farther down the street, and another, and another. Within moments, he realized there were at least 6 of them scattered throughout the block. None of the figures moved. They simply stood there, facing his apartment building. Ethan felt his chest tighten with panic. He quickly closed the curtain and stepped away from the window. This couldn't be real. There was no logical explanation. His breathing became faster as he tried convincing himself he was imagining things. Perhaps exhaustion was affecting his judgment. Perhaps stress had triggered some kind of breakdown. Yet deep down he knew what he had seen. Those figures were real, and they were watching him. Determined to prove it to himself, Ethan grabbed his phone and returned to the window. He pulled back the curtain and aimed the camera toward the street. The figures were still there. He snapped several photographs, then he zoomed in on one of them. The image appeared blurry at first. As the focus sharpened, Ethan felt his blood run cold. The figure wasn't looking at the apartment building anymore. It was looking directly at his window. Somehow it seemed aware that he was watching. The head slowly tilted to one side. Ethan nearly dropped the phone. Before he could take another photograph, every street light outside suddenly went dark. The block disappeared into complete darkness. Ethan stood frozen beside the window. For several seconds he couldn't see anything at all. Then one street light flickered back on. The bus stop shelter was empty. The figure had vanished. More lights gradually returned across the street. Every one of the shadowy figures was gone. The sidewalks were deserted. It was as if they had never been there. Ethan backed away from the glass, shaken to his core. The following morning, Ethan barely slept. He spent hours examining the photographs he had taken. Most of them were blurry because of the rain. However, one image clearly showed a tall figure beneath the bus stop shelter. Ethan uploaded the photo to his computer and enlarged it. At first, he focused on the figure itself. Then he noticed something hidden in the background. Standing across the street behind the shelter was another person. Unlike the others, this individual appeared normal. He wore a dark jacket and baseball cap. Most importantly, he was holding something that looked like a camera. Ethan stared at the image for nearly a minute. a possibility slowly formed in his mind. What if someone was orchestrating everything? What if there was a human connection behind the sightings and messages? The thought offered a small amount of hope. A stalker was terrifying, but at least it was something he could understand. Determined to investigate, Ethan spent the day reviewing security footage from nearby businesses. Several stores refused to help. Eventually, a convenience store owner agreed to show him recordings from the previous night. Together, they examined hours of footage. Near midnight, the camera captured something unusual. A man wearing a dark jacket appeared briefly on screen. He stood across from Ethan's apartment building for several minutes before walking away. Ethan immediately recognized him as the person in the photograph. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify his face. However, one detail stood out. As the man turned, a patch was visible on the sleeve of his jacket. The symbol resembled a circle containing a series of strange lines. Ethan had seen that marking before. His heart skipped a beat. It matched a marking carved into the old warning sign he discovered in the forest. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment studying screenshots from the security footage. The symbol connected the mysterious man to the woods. Whether he was a witness, a researcher, or something far worse, Ethan didn't know. But for the first time, he had a real lead. He was no longer dealing only with whispers, shadows, and impossible sightings. There was a person involved, a person who might know the truth. As he continued studying the images, another notification appeared on his phone. It was a new text message from an unknown number. This time, there were only 2 words. Too late. The message stayed on Ethan's screen for several seconds. Too late. Those 2 words felt heavier than any threat he had received before. He immediately tried calling the number, but it was disconnected. Frustrated, he threw his phone onto the couch and stared at the screenshots from the security footage. The symbol on the man's jacket seemed familiar for a reason he couldn't explain. He opened every photograph he had taken during the camping trip. One by one, he examined them carefully. Then he found it. Carved into the faded warning sign near the trail was the exact same symbol. Someone had deliberately marked that place. The question was, why? The next morning, Ethan contacted Forest Watcher 72 again. This time, the response came within minutes. The user asked him to stop communicating through messages and suggested a phone call instead. An hour later, Ethan found himself speaking with an elderly man named Richard. His voice sounded tired, as though he had spent years carrying a burden he no longer wanted. Richard explained that he had been researching the disappearances for nearly 2 decades. According to him, the symbol belonged to a small group of investigators who quietly tracked unusual events connected to the forest. Most members eventually quit, some disappeared, others became obsessed. Richard was one of the few who remained. Richard revealed something that immediately caught Ethan's attention. Every confirmed disappearance had one thing in common. The victims all reported hearing voices before they vanished. Some heard family members, others friends or loved ones who had passed away. The voices always tried to lure them somewhere, into the trees, away from camp, toward the darkness. Richard believed the phenomenon wasn't random. He thought it was hunting. Whatever existed in those woods appeared to study people, learn their memories, discover their fears and attachments. Then it used those things against them. Later that day, Richard sent Ethan a collection of old files. The documents included witness statements, photographs, and handwritten notes. Most were disturbing, but one report stood out. It described a survivor who escaped the forest in 1978. The man claimed he followed the voice of his missing daughter into the woods. After hours of searching, he eventually found a clearing. Standing in the center was a tall figure. According to the report, the figure spoke using dozens of different voices at once: men, women, children. The survivor fled immediately and never returned. He spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss what happened there. As Ethan continued reviewing the files, a terrible realization began to form. The voices weren't merely copying sounds. They seemed to understand the people they targeted. They knew personal details, memories, relationships. Somehow the entity knew exactly what to say. Richard believed that was why so many victims followed it. The creature didn't rely on force, it relied on trust. It became someone familiar, someone loved, someone impossible to ignore. Ethan thought about hearing his mother's voice outside the tent. Even now, the memory felt painfully real. For a brief moment that night, part of him had wanted to open the tent and follow it. That evening, Richard called again. His tone was urgent. He asked Ethan a question that immediately made him uneasy. "Have you noticed missing time?" Ethan paused before answering. Over the past week, there had been moments he couldn't fully account for, minutes that seemed to disappear, small gaps in memory. At first, he blamed stress and lack of sleep. Richard became silent for several seconds. Then he explained that many survivors reported the same thing. According to witness accounts, the encounters often didn't end when people left the forest. Sometimes the phenomenon continued. Sometimes it followed them. Unable to ignore the warning, Ethan reviewed footage from a security camera inside his apartment. What he discovered terrified him. On 3 separate nights, he had left his apartment while apparently asleep. The recordings showed him walking into the hallway shortly after midnight. Each time, he remained gone for several minutes before returning. Ethan had absolutely no memory of these events. His pulse raced as he watched himself standing motionless in the hallway. In one recording, he appeared to be listening to something. Then he slowly nodded before returning inside. The footage ended there. Ethan immediately checked the time stamps. All 3 incidents occurred shortly after he received mysterious messages. That night, Ethan refused to sleep. He brewed coffee and sat in front of his computer. Around 2 a.m., his phone lit up with another unknown call. He ignored it. Moments later, another call arrived, then another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. Against his better judgment, Ethan played the message. At first, there was only static. Then came his mother's voice. She sounded calm and gentle. She told him she was waiting. She told him she missed him. Then she said something that made Ethan's blood run cold. She mentioned a childhood memory that only he and his mother had ever known. For the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan felt genuine temptation. The voice sounded so real, so familiar. For several seconds he closed his eyes and listened. Then he remembered Richard's warning. The thing in the forest wasn't speaking to him, it was using him. Ethan deleted the voicemail immediately. Seconds later, every light in the apartment went out. The room plunged into darkness. Ethan remained perfectly still. Outside his window, a long whistle echoed through the night. Then another answered it from farther away. Then another. Within moments, whistles surrounded the building from every direction. Heart pounding, Ethan looked through the window. Dozens of dark figures stood along the street below, more than he had ever seen before. They lined the sidewalks, parking lots, and intersections. Every one of them faced the apartment building. None moved, none spoke, yet Ethan understood something in that moment. They weren't there for him anymore. They were waiting for him to make a choice, to answer the call, to step outside, to follow the voice into the darkness. It was the same trap that had claimed countless others over the years. As dawn approached, the whistles gradually stopped. One by one, the figures disappeared with the darkness. By sunrise, the streets were empty again. Ethan packed a bag, left the apartment, and moved across the country a few days later. He changed his phone number. He deleted his online accounts. He never returned to Montana. Years have passed since that terrifying week, and the messages have stopped. The sightings have stopped. Most nights, he even sleeps peacefully. But every now and then, usually just before dawn, Ethan wakes suddenly from a nightmare. In the dream, he hears a distant whistle drifting through the trees, and somewhere far beyond the darkness, his mother's voice is still calling his name.